find us some chairs. Oh, thank you. Now you have to listen to me. No, I'm teasing. Thank you, everybody. And I apologize. I'm rushing this because my board of trustees is meeting upstairs, and they're waiting on me, and they sign my paycheck. So I can't stay very long, but I did want to come down and to say a sincere welcome to all of you. By the way, when we have outside events like this, we always start with a little safety announcement. And so Frank Verastro, who's back there, he's the responsible safety officer. He's going to take care of you. And if anything happens, follow his instructions. Exits are obviously right back. One goes right out to the street. But just follow his instructions. Nothing's going to happen, but I just want everybody to be prepared. This is a real privilege to have this session today. The world of energy is upside down. I mean, we're in such profoundly different territory, and we need to understand what it means. And this is a place where we don't normally focus on Africa and South America. I mean, we tend to think about you talk a lot about China, we talk a lot about Europe, etc. We don't tend to think about South America and Africa. And we have people here that can help us in an unusual way. Amos, of course, well, he's responsible for energy at the State Department for the whole world. So you can ask him any question you want. I mean, that's perfectly fine. Ali is probably one of the premier international energy experts in the world. He spent so much of his career in South America, and he's a genuine expert. He knows that landscape better than anybody in the energy dynamics. And so we're really very, very fortunate to have him here. And of course, with Robin, I mean, I don't need to say anything. Robin is kind of the eminence, this gray eminence that kind of hangs over and occasionally gives me a lot of good guidance, not only on energy, but also how to run CSIS. So I'm thankful for that, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Robin, and thank you. Really, we're really delighted that you're here. This is an excellent opportunity for all of us. Would you please welcome them with your applause?
Well, we started a few minutes late, but we've taken care of introductions. So we will get right into it. The subject is energy security in Latin America and Africa. But to kind of have an orderly conversation here with two people who are, as John pointed out, very well qualified, but come from very different points of view. Ali has run Africa and Latin America for Chevron for years. He really is one of the most experienced oil men in the world. And Amos is at state, and so he has a unique perspective from the standpoint of the U.S. government, and there are a lot of sensitive issues in Latin America and in Africa. But let me begin, when we were talking on the phone before organizing this, we said, let's try and answer a few questions to give this a little structure. Each person has a different perspective, which is what we want to bring out. And then we'll have a little discussion amongst ourselves and then open it up to the floor here. So, Ali, why don't I begin with you and just saying a couple questions. What's different about the oil markets this time? What are the implications for government and industry, specifically in Latin America? And then when we really get to Venezuela and Nigeria, what do you think's going on? One can become very gloomy very fast in this conversation. Is there any good news in all of this? What about natural gas? So far the conversation will be all about oil, but what about gas?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, and very broad audience in here want to hear about the region. Latin America and Africa is kind of ignored when it comes to the energy, especially the oil part, because we all focus is Middle East. People don't realize there's a vast resources, oil and gas in Africa, Latin America. Actually, if you look at the continent of America, we've got more resources than the entire Middle East and Russia put together. And other things that we do have is the technology and infrastructure, which majority of the country don't have that. Today, when you take a snapshot of what's going on, everybody thinks this was a sudden change in the oil industry. Actually, the oil industry gone through the evolution since 1970. Before nationalization, most of the resources were in hands of the IOCs. Then nationalization happened. Then we felt like all the resources are in hands of national oil company. Then we were worried about where we're going to get the resources. Then National Oil Company become partially IOC, and suddenly price collapse that we inherited about a year and a half, 2 years ago. This is an industry that goes through the evolution. Whether or not it's the ownership of the resources, whether or not rebalancing of production, supply and demand, or technology breakthrough. Actually, what I think has happened is significant, is a technology breakthrough in our industry. People underestimate how much technology breakthrough has happened. I started my career 40 years ago, and I remember when I used to go talk to my supervisor talking about 150 feet of water drilling. He looked at me and said, what, next time you're going to come and ask for 500 feet? Today, we are drilling in 10,000 feet of water safe. And if you think about 10,000 feet of water, and we drill additional 15,000 feet, that's 25,000 feet of pipe we run. It's all automated, high level of safety, and get the resources out. Now, you take the tight oil, tight gas, shale oil, shale gas. It's all through the technology. Therefore, we do not have the resource shortage anymore. If you recall it, in 1980s, 90s, we were talking about we're going to run out of oil by 2000. Actually, we don't have resource issue. What problem we got is rebalancing supply and demand. Also, what has changed, in the past, energy security for the United States was a topic of the pricing. Okay, anytime you talk about demand, was looking at the US. Where is the US demand going? Today, that's not the case. Actually, we got oversupply in our country. We can be an exporter. We are exporter. We're exporting LNG, we're exporting oil. Actually, believe it or not, energy security is there for us. We can actually play a significant role even in the overall market of the energy balance globally. And all that due to the technology and access to the resources. The changes that happen today is a price. It's not necessarily anything significant to change the equation. And the change in the price was purely supply and demand. It was a supply and demand that everybody underestimated the capacity and capability of unconventional and how technology can have an impact. And it was a surprise even to the big company. Be honest with you, unconventional didn't start by a major oil company. Unconventional started by a small company. Implementing the technology, kind of aggregate that one into a larger scale. 4 million barrels came into the market, and suddenly we find ourselves the price cannot support that much supply. But this is a cycle business. It's going to go through a cycle. Because what's going to happen, everybody's pulling back on the investment, and natural resources, natural decline is going to take over it. The problem, the price hasn't recovered as fast as we are expecting, is because there is always momentum in your investment. For the deep water, it's 10 years. The only asset that doesn't have that strong momentum is unconventional. Unconventional is the one, is almost a 1-year cycle. That basically you'll be able to accelerate and decelerate. And this is what it makes our country so strong regarding controlling, having an energy security. We'll be able to increase production in the United States much faster than any other country if the demand come in play. And also the way the technology has been implemented. Regarding the good news is low prices are not bad. It creates efficiency. It brings efficiency to our industry. Our industry needs once in a while to go through the mode of efficiency. What does it mean, efficiency? Cost of goods and services escalated so high that we couldn't keep up with it. Cost of development in 2016 increased by 125% compared to 2015. And it's the same service, it's the same material, everything. And partially was a supply and demand for accelerating production. It kind of balanced itself out, technology going to take it, and we're expecting the oil going to be recovered. That's the good news. But in the meantime, we go through the efficiency side. Short answer to your question, Robert.
What's your take on, how do you see Venezuela and Nigeria?
Well, you know, they are countries that they highly depend on the oil revenue. It has been going on for years and years and years. The last decade, it really gave a perception that the price of oil is going to stay high and it's going to continue to grow. Well, some countries that they are 100% dependent on the oil revenue, it came as a shock to them. If you look at Nigeria, you look at Venezuela, that highly depends on the oil revenue. If the oil price dropped from $80 to $28, government revenue has impacted significantly. In some of the countries, that revenue is part of the equation because they diversify. In Venezuela and Nigeria, that's not the case. For right now, you see low price impacted those countries much significant than others. You take a country like Saudi Arabia, of course impacted Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia got such a reserve, large reserve, that they can ride this storm. They are like big IOCs, like big companies, that they can ride that low price, and when the price recovers, to do that. When you take Nigeria and Venezuela, that they highly leverage the oil revenue for the social investment. When that cut back, then you do have internal problem, you got other economic problem that it impacted. You cannot blame it on the oil price, because if anybody believe, whether or not it is private sector or the government, that the oil prices is not going to go through a cycle, that is a bad bet. You got to assume it's going to happen, and you got to be ready for it. Some of these countries weren't ready for it, and that's the reason you see the impact today.
We can continue this further. Amos?
Well, first I'll say, Ali, you introduced Ali as the oil man. I'll say that the beautiful thing and the amazing thing about the energy sector is that it is intertwined with geopolitics. I don't know any other sector that is as closely linked. So Ali is as much a foreign policy politician as he is an oil man in his job, and a man that we turn to for his perspective, even on foreign policy issues, as he sees the region. Look, I think that I agree with a lot of what Ali said. I do believe that there's been a fundamental change, though, in the market. What you hear often is in the media and the analysis is two approaches. One is the hyperventilation every time oil prices go up or down, and every time a bunch of people get together in Vienna. And the second, and I think that's a byproduct of a 24-hour news media that affects news, it affects coverage of news, but it also affects coverage of oil markets. A fundamentally long-term business that is being judged on an hourly basis is probably not a good way to look at it. The second way of looking at what's happening is to say, oh, nothing new here. We saw this in the 70s, we saw it in 86, we saw it in 98. Oil prices fluctuate. We have destruction. Sometimes they are more aggressive destruction of price than other times, and this is just one of those times. I personally believe that we're not in that case. In other words, there is truth to the matter that we are yet in a cycle. But I think there's a difference in this cycle than there has been before, and it was foreshadowed in the couple of years leading up to this price reduction. And I'll pick up on something that Ali said. The technological innovations that have happened in the energy sector are happening much faster now than they happened before, just like any other sector. So advances are happening very fast, and they're having big impacts. What happened in the United States, where if you just look when I started thinking about coming to this job in 2010 or 2011, and I was told, shale gas revolution was great, shale oil is not possible because it's just too expensive. And a year and a half later, we were in a tight oil revolution. What happened in the United States that affected the markets didn't only affect the markets because we put 4 million barrels on the market, relatively speaking, overnight in a period of a few years. It also changed the dynamic of how the market recovers, because the tight oil is more flexible. It is faster to come off or to come on. It is easier to manage from that perspective, and it's essentially operating now as a potential private sector-led swing producer in the market, instead of the role that OPEC or, in reality, Saudi was playing before. So as prices go up, and we don't know what price point that is, at some point it will kickstart production again in tight oil and some of the conventional oil in the United States. So that gives, when you look at OPEC countries and others, that gives a certain change and a difference that just cutting production, freezing production, or even coming back into balance, yes, prices go up, but how far? Do they recover to where we were before? Or have we seen this fundamental change in the market that I believe we have as a result of the US play? I also think that the problem that OPEC has is that it has two different sets of countries, as Ali just started addressing. One set is the countries that have reserves and don't like what's going on, would rather see a higher price, but it's not of imminent danger to their social contract, to their stability of the government. While there are other countries where a point comes where you don't have reserves and your 80–90% of your revenues are now severely cut, and not only are you not making the money that you were making before from sales of oil, but the capex reduction is affecting you as well, because new investment means fewer jobs in projects that were destined to start now. So it hits you twice. You don't have the reserves. You have populations that have come to say, look, I don't have a great life, but at the very least, you get to manage the resources and I get to live in peace, and you supply me with education and health and other things. But at some point, that's no longer possible. Governments are going to start having to make decisions on where they're going to cut. And they're going to have to cut the subsidies, and they're going to have to cut some of the social services. What does that do to societal structures? And there we're starting to see, now that we're a year into this, that $50 is probably not going to, going up from $28 to $50 is impressive, but it's not going to cut it as far as the budget support in these countries. You asked about Nigeria and Venezuela. I think those are the most discussed, but that's not the totality of the universe of where I'm concerned. So in a way, from a government perspective, from a US government perspective, there's an inverse relationship to what is discussed in the media to what I'm really worried about. So you can talk about Saudi Arabia and UAE and Kuwait and Iran. They'll survive. They have money. They have reserves. I'm worried about everybody else. And what happens there? Venezuela, I think, is in a class of its own, because you talk about, when Chavez came to power, they were over 3 million barrels a day of production. When he left power, they were 2.5 million barrels a day of production. That was under $100 oil. So they were able to destroy their own industry all by themselves without the support of the market. So there has to be, for oil prices going up in Venezuela doesn't change the fundamental problems that they have in the country and how they're addressing their oil sector. If you take every dollar out of the oil sector and use it and don't spend any money back in investment in the sector, you're going to have a problem. So I put Venezuela a little bit in a different place, where you have a government policy that has single-handedly destroyed the largest reserves in the world from being able to profit from it and survive it. Nigeria is going through a very difficult period, because not only are they losing the funds because of the price decline, but as a result of less funding, the ability to combat terrorism and national security threats is hampered, which at the end of the day results, and their ability to invest economically in the country is hampered. As a result, you're now seeing an increase in terrorist activity, which takes barrels off the market, which creates this cycle that is very dangerous. I think that the international community, the United States, we have to pay far more attention to Nigeria, and to not only to Nigeria in the country, and I think we're going to have, some of our folks have been traveling out to Nigeria and see what we can do to support, but from a security perspective, the international community is going to have to do something to support Nigeria's offshore. That's going to affect not only Nigeria, it's going to affect several countries that have platforms and workers and investment in those platforms. So this is truly something that will affect, obviously, Nigeria more than anyone else, but all of us. And it's at our own peril if we continue to only look at the Middle East and only look at North Africa without paying attention to what is happening right now in Nigeria. And if it goes unchecked in Nigeria, it could start expanding and moving further into other areas in West Africa as well, where we have, if you look at an aerial map, we have dotted the entire ocean there, all the way down to Angola with platforms from every country around the world represented. So this is something that we have to look at more seriously. But again, I would say that their problems are more unique individually, Venezuela and Nigeria, than reflective of the rest of the region. I'll end with just one comment that Ali made about the Americas have the resource. Energy security was seen by the political class in the United States as meaning we don't import anything. That is not energy security. And even if it were true, the price in the United States would not be immune to energy shocks elsewhere. So nobody can imagine if the Macondo disaster, not even terrorism, just a Macondo disaster happens somewhere in the Arabian Gulf that drives prices up, that would not have an effect in the United States, regardless of how much we import. So energy security is about having, I actually think we're now more secure than we've probably ever been. We have seen a remarkable growth in oil production, in gas production. Our renewable energy industry is growing remarkably. The innovation around the world in energy, whether it's in fossil or in renewable, is coming out of the United States. The investment in R&D is in the United States. Efficiency rates are getting better in the United States. So any way that you define the word energy, we're doing pretty well. So I think that we are energy secure, but we have to, in order to maintain that kind of security, we can't only look at our own shores, at our own home. We have to pay the most attention, I think, in building up the Americas, our region, our hemisphere, but also worry about the disruption potential around the world.
Okay, let's go back and talk about Venezuela and Nigeria a little bit. And how are they, I mean, they're both arguably failed states of one description or another, large oil producing failed states. But it seems to me they got there in different ways, and that you could have the timing of the crisis in each country. Well, are these countries headed for crisis, do you believe? And if so, how quickly would it take place?
Yeah, if you look at Venezuela by itself, I mean, Venezuela got more resources than Saudi Arabia. But if you look at the Venezuela oil industry, I'm focusing on PDVSA, the oil industry has been abused. That means limited budget, limited growth, limited training. For PDVSA people are working hard today. They executive work very hard. But you know, our industry is capital intensive. You have to spend money to produce the barrel of oil. If government think at the low prices you're going to increase the production, ain't going to happen. At the low prices, if you want to increase the production, you've got to do like what Saudi Arabia has done, increase the number of the rigs. If you increase the number of the rigs, that means you're going to bring investment in. Therefore, in Venezuela, the aspiration of where the revenue comes in doesn't necessarily work with what the direction government taking. You need more foreign investment. You need more investment internally to get that production back to where it was before. Therefore, they kind of work opposite to each other. But at the same time, I honestly believe that I've been working with PDVSA for many, many years. Today, that is an organization that is running as fast as it can, trying to generate as much as barrels as possible, and it starts at the highest level to the lowest level. But again, it's been abused. They produce the production, they got to increase the production, which is very difficult to do. The revenue that is generated is not satisfying the needs of the country. They constantly go into the deficit. Venezuela, the only direction I see for Venezuela, the best direction is to maintain what they have, honestly. That's the reality. Otherwise, if the investment doesn't come in more and more, whether or not directly through the government or via private sector, is a natural decline in the oil field. I mean, that's the petroleum engineering 101. Every resource decline is a natural decline. Therefore, the production in Venezuela continue to decline. Unfortunate thing is when you look at where the production is and the resource base in Venezuela, R over P means reserve over the production, it goes to about 400 years. That's not the rate that you want to produce. If you look at the value of the barrel sitting in the ground, it's been destroyed. Therefore, you got to stimulate the economy and the oil industry to get it jump-started. And it's going to be very difficult for Venezuela to do that today. Therefore, the best strategy is stay where they are, work through it, make sure it doesn't decline anymore. But honestly, I'm very concerned about further decline in the production in Venezuela. I really do. Again, it's just based on my practical experience. You need to have investment to maintain your production. 25% of our total capital expenditure in Chevron goes to maintaining the production. And we're still, on the base level, we decline at 4%. It's the natural. And when you look at the Venezuela and PDVSA investment, it's so low that it's very difficult to make that happen. In Nigeria case, Nigeria, it's much more complicated. As my colleague Amos pointed out, the security issue is drive the investor out. That's a reality. All of us, all of the major oil companies are there. One of our number one priority for us is security. And that's the security of our asset, our people. And as you have seen on the headlines, the militants have been quite busy in the last month or so. Therefore, return of the investment to Nigeria is going to be highly dependent on assurance by the government and demonstration by government that we can move in, with the larger investment in the country. If it's not, Nigeria is going to be very much in parallel as Venezuela for the different reason. Because if you look at it, I can tell you for the last 8 years, not a single project has been developed in Nigeria. And if it's developed, it was putting the flare out or it was a specific project that IOC has done. And again, if they don't watch it and address the security, you're going to see the investment continue to even go below the baseline. Because right now, the money is going to maintain the decline. But if we pull back on that, then you're going to see a decline at much sharper pace that we have seen. For both countries, got the same problem, declining production if they don't change their strategy. And again, the oil industry in both countries has been very much abused. It's the only source of revenue for the government, and you cannot do that. When you do that one, then when you go to the lower cycle price, you put more pressure on the system.
Now, Ali, saying that the oil industry has been abused, and I would agree, is a very tactful way of describing what's happened in these countries is massive corruption and gross mismanagement.
You know, the reason I use the term software abuse is because, you know, in my business, there are two parts to it. One is the asset, the other one is people. Okay? When you go places like Venezuela or Nigeria, and you see people are working kind of tough environment, and I'm not talking about expatriate, I'm talking about our Nigerian or Venezuelan national. They are the one working day and night, trying to get that barrel out. Okay? The executives working day and night, trying to get that out. And there is a tremendous pressure from the system to increase the revenue. Well, the revenue from oil business is multiplying production by price. They can't do anything on the price side of it. They got to deal with the production. And when there is not revenue, when there is not investment coming in, it puts tremendous stress on the individual. Some of the folks on those national oil companies are working tremendously hard to the point that you're expecting one day they're going to say that's enough. You know, that's the reason I use the term abuse. So
Okay.
Told you he was a diplomat.
Very smooth. Amos?
Look, corruption is something that has been part of has dogged the energy sector around the world for a very long time. And that's something that we're all working to try to see how we minimize it. But I, you know, and clearly that has an effect. I do think, you know, I'm not a pessimist. I'm an optimist, and I think that we get better headlines on pessimism than we do on optimism. And I think the world is doing fairly well. Nigeria is going through. We have spots in which we have real concerns. That doesn't mask the fact that, by and large, the energy sector around the world is doing very, very well. It's just not the same energy sector that we used to have. I think in Nigeria, we're starting to see finally some capturing of gas and utilization of gas for the power sector, which is incredibly important. The fact that we're flaring away the amounts of gas in places like Iraq or in Nigeria and elsewhere is just taking money and setting it on flames. They need the help. I think they have a government now with President Buhari who understands the sector, who would like to see some changes. We are seeing some.
Will he have the ability to affect change?
Well, I think the first step in affecting change is undoing harm. And before he was there was real harm being done. And I think the previous minister was involved in corruption, involved in a lot of other things that were doing tremendous damage to Nigeria's present and future. The hanging in the balance of the PIB, the Petroleum Ministry Bill, it wasn't about whether they were going to adopt it or not, but the fact that nobody knew for their investment what the investment climate was going to look like, what the rules of the game were going to look like, keeping it in limbo for all those years was really harmful. So I think the first thing is putting in place, removing people who were bad stewards of the energy sector, improving that environment. We've had good discussions with him personally. Our teams have now been out there. There's a receptivity to help and support, and we're committed to doing that. So are there problems? Yes, obviously. But it's also, people have to remember, he walked into office with essentially empty coffers. The price of oil, his real, as Ali said, his principal income producer, going down 70-80%. Terrorism that he has been fighting around the country with Boko Haram, and then now having to deal with shutting down hundreds of thousands of barrels of production as a result of the Niger Delta. I mean, this is a challenge that nobody would want. And this is a very difficult set of conditions. Having said that, I think that he is trying to do his best, and we're going to be supportive of that. So I think I'm not only focused on Nigeria, but I think clearly it's the largest country, and they need to be in a better footing, and we have to do what we can to support them.
What about Venezuela? Do you want to say something?
I want to add on to what Amos said regarding Nigeria. Actually, absolutely, President Buhari has brought the structure in the industry. Some of them that was mentioned early on. There's a clear direction where he wants to go. The security is the one delaying his initiative. Honestly, I speak for my company. If the security was there, the level of investment would be completely different. And he needs to address that. But have that in mind. Today's problem, it didn't happen just during President Buhari's 6 months in the office. This has been going on as long as I remember, which lasts 20 years. Probably, I'm not sure it's going to get better or worse, but this is something that I believe President Buhari is going to address that one way or another, because he's so focused on it. Nigeria is in the right track with the president that he used to be a minister as well, and he's currently Minister of Petroleum. That means he put the emphasis that he want to understand what's going on in our industry. Those are all positive attributes, that strategically he's in the right direction. Unfortunately, there's too many disruption. And those disruption doesn't happen by the people in Abuja. It's happened by militant. And if you look at what militants are doing, actually it's destructive. They think they are hurting international oil company. Actually, they're hurting their own government that has a lack of revenue. Why you want to shut in 200,000 barrels a day of the production, that 60% goes to the national oil company. Actually, government takes is over 85%. That means you're cutting the revenue to government for that barrel by 85%. Just do a simple math. And militant is asking for what we want to share of whatever it is. But this is something that you gotta work with it, but we have high level of confidence in the administration of President Buhari that he would be able to manage this, and we see what the future look like.
But there's a different responsibility in who's responsible for what. And I think that the government's role, and especially the new structures that he's put in place, were intended to renew confidence by the IOCs and the markets in general, so IOCs and banks to be able to finance projects, in that Nigeria was going to be in a better place, and it was a good place to invest. And I think that was going to work. That's his role in cleaning up the petroleum governmental sector. When it comes to security, yes, it's his job, but I don't think, if this is Nigeria's job, it's not going to be solved, because this is too big a challenge. And if you look at the challenges that are similar to Nigeria and other parts of the world, we intervene, in support in one way or another. Other governments in Europe intervene in support in one way or another. But here, that's happened from a security perspective in a relatively small, comparatively in a small way. And that's something that we have to look at now, and I think the latest attacks in the Delta against the platforms are a good wake-up call for us, but not just for the United States, for our allies as well, to address it in the same way that we address it elsewhere in the world, in order to be able to get to what Ali's talking about.
You didn't talk about Venezuela.
Well, I think I thought I was being clear. I think Venezuela is a people you threw around failed state or not. I don't know what the definition of a failed state is or isn't. There is a government. It does have structures. It does control the country and the economy not very well, very poorly, and the security situation is horrible. They have committed this is just malpractice of managing a country's resource. You have a God-given resource that, as Ali said, is the largest in the world. It's larger than Saudi Arabia. And you're now down from 3.5 million peak to 2.5 million and going down. And not only are you down, but you're selling your oil at reduced prices because your ability to bring in diluents and other things to upgrade your oil results in even lower prices that you're able to achieve. So even when Brent's at 50, they're not getting anywhere near that. So the malpractice that this government is guilty of towards their own people, and the mismanagement of a sector that was given to them and handed to them for no good deed or any deed. That was just, it's there. All they got is a country with a lot of resources, and they're blowing it away. So what has to happen, I'm not a political expert on Venezuela. I can tell you that I don't know who's going to come in government next, or if anybody does. But whoever's in control of that country has a clear ability to make a change. They just have to decide that they want to do that. They have to make a decision that yes, you want to diversify your economy away from energy resources. That's something that we will always support. But you have this massive resource, do something with it, and manage it properly, and ensure that beyond the rhetoric, that the country, every person in the country is able to benefit from this resource. That hasn't happened.
Let me ask one last question, then turn to the audience. If there's a view in the oil markets that one of the reasons price of oil's moved up is because of potential outages, or real or potential outages, from Venezuela and Nigeria, among others. But as these countries deteriorate, are either of them on the brink of crisis? And if something were to happen sooner rather than later, which one would you think is more on the edge? Amos?
I thought you trained Ali.
Thanks, Amos. Well, you got to look at it from 2 points of view. One is the production itself, which national oil company is focusing on. Neither country are in the verge of breaking. I don't think you're going to turn around PDVSA production being at 1 million barrels. That ain't going to happen. Neither Nigeria. There is enough investment coming in. We're investing money in Venezuela, we're investing money in Nigeria, others doing the same thing, less in Venezuela. Venezuela is a strategic country for us, as well as Nigeria. Therefore, you're going to see a decline. But what's going to happen is how long the government can sustain, can afford receiving just that kind of revenue at that price and live with the volatility in the price. I mean, that there is no guarantee that the oil price going to stay 50. I mean, that some people may feel like 50 is a good recovery, but there is no guarantee. And if you bet the total revenue and what you got to do for a country based on the oil revenue, that's a wrong assumption. I think that's when you're going to see the country going to have problems. But one of the things that I have full belief that Venezuela recovery is going to be fast. Venezuela, if political situation or changes happen in Venezuela, or investment goes back to Venezuela, whatever is the driver behind it, the capacity of the resources is there. Venezuela resources are relatively easy to be produced compared to Nigeria. Nigeria, they got swamp, they got offshore, they got deep water. Somebody told me, and I'm a petroleum engineer, I tell you, it's very difficult to drill a dry hole in Venezuela. You really got to try hard. I remember when President Chavez started looking for gas, it started gas initiative. With a matter of 10 years, they found over 30 TCF of gas. Therefore, from a resource point of view, it's paradise for us. Cost of exploration is low, cost of development is low. Recovery from Venezuela could be very rapid. Can Venezuela get to the 3.5, 4 million barrels in the future with the right level of investment? Of course, I believe in that. Nigeria is going to be a different situation because Nigeria problem is also much more complicated from the geopolitical point of view, from the relationship between North and South, where the oil is, how you address the militants and so forth. Even the resources are there, the time to get to that level is going to be more difficult. But Venezuela can be jump-start very quickly if investment go back into the country. The level of investment that we're putting in other countries as an industry, we put it in Venezuela, Venezuela production would be much above 3.5 million barrels a day. And like I said, it's not complicated, doesn't require heavy technology. It's one of those easy oil that it can be accessed.
I think you asked about the disruption. I actually think the disruptions that we're seeing, fires in Canada taking 1 million barrels off, Venezuela destruction, Nigeria attacks, actually shows the strength that $50 is, we're not about to see a major rise in price, at least not one that is based on supply and demand. We saw 1.5 million barrels go off the market in the same week between Canada and Nigeria. And the oil prices, the oil markets yawned. When 1.6 million barrels a day went off the market when the Libyan war started, we had a crisis. We had a spike in oil that of tremendous magnitude that caused us to release from the SPR and so on. So, and here, 1.5 million barrels, and it wasn't a secret, it was all over the news, and yet it didn't really address anything. And I think that tells you something about where we are in the supply and demand. But I don't want to get lost in the fact that, and by the way, the flip side is true too. In other words, if some of these, as these disruptions sort of subside and the fires go away and we have production in Canada come back, you're talking about 1 million barrels that come back into the market. And the same is true for Nigeria. Those barrels can come back. But I think we get lost when we talk about Venezuela too much because the region is in a very different place. Yes, Mexico just went through massive reforms, historic reforms. They had the bad luck of getting through those reforms just as the prices were going down, and people confuse the loss of jobs and economic distress at Pemex as a result of reforms versus 80% reduction in price. Colombia relies on oil production of just under 1 million barrels a day, and they need to deal with this. But look at the story in Argentina, which proves to some degree what Ali and I have been saying. If you have a change in government, a change in policy, a change in investment climate, look what could happen. And here you have a new government in Argentina that did all the right things when it came in, had to deal with declaring an energy emergency within weeks of coming into office. But the potential is great in Argentina. The unconventional potential in Argentina is great. So I think it's a much broader story of the Americas than just looking through the prism of Venezuela. I think there's a lot of really exciting things going on in Central America, in the Caribbean, on renewable energy as well as on fossil energy. And then I think the same thing in Africa, where I think that we have a lot of unrealized potential, and I think the message that for Africa really is to look at how government actions have taken away potentials and things that came on the table, and by fighting about the revenues of projects that never happened yet, really destroyed it. And at $100 oil, look at what happened in Mozambique. We were all talking about this massive resource in Mozambique and Tanzania, but it never made it to production. And at this oil price environment, it's still difficult to see how that moves forward in a speedy way. In the Gulf of Guinea, if you define it from Angola up to Cameroon, I think there's a lot of warning signs there of which country did what during the high oil prices of putting money away, creating the kind of investments that will sustain them through the bad period, and it's a mixed bag. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this period. I don't know that I believe that we're going back to 100 plus oil prices in a sustained way, the way that we had before, absent some unforeseen events like wars and and natural disasters or accidents, but in a sustained way going above 100. So now you have to start thinking about what I talked about before in Africa, which is how do you manage this period without social strife, without instability, political instability, without governments falling.
Okay. Well, hands are flying up. Would you, A, take a microphone, B, please ask a question, identify yourself and then ask a question, and a few simple declarative sentences or questions, question marks, and then get to the audience.
Bill Eichhorn, consultant with a background in the energy industry. Wanted to pick up on the Argentina comment and ask maybe if, Ali, if you could comment on, sure. If you look at the shale oil maps of the world, Argentina pops out as one with great potential and reasonable government, as Amos has talked about. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of, what's your handicapping of Argentina in a lower price environment or a more moderate price environment?
Well, Amos pointed out about Argentina. We were one of the first companies put a huge investment in Argentina, actually quite a bit of investment. And we look at tight oil, tight gas, or unconventional in general, globally. Really, it has really worked out in North America and Argentina so far. And your point is very valid if you look at the map, as those are the two areas. What we are doing right now, because of the vast experience we got in North America, we're taking our experience in Argentina. And the learning curve we have gone through is much faster pace that industry gained in the United States, because we are not making those mistakes. We don't want to make those mistakes. And we are very optimistic about Argentina. This is show how interrelated petropolitics is. The government of Argentina actually incentivizes us to continue to invest, because the crude that we are producing is actually used internally. And the way that they see that, they're giving us a higher price to continue with our investment versus and taking the oil, refine it, and put it in the oil market, versus buying the product probably seems to be cheaper from somewhere else, paying to the other party and bring it internally. Therefore, they did a calculation and they incentivized us to continue with our investment. We're receiving a much higher price, and it's kind of a steady. While it's fluctuating in this side, they offer us a fixed price. And based on that, we design our program and moving forward. We are encouraging the government to continue to do that. Why? Like I said, at the earliest stage of the unconventional, you got to feed the system with capital expenditure. It's the same thing goes with Venezuela. I made a statement that Venezuela got all the resources. But do you know how much investment Venezuela needs to get to 4 million barrels? Ain't gonna happen. The worlds are not producing 20,000 barrels or 30,000 barrels a day like in Deepwater Gulf of Mexico. The worlds are producing about 1,000 barrels a day. Therefore, to get to 4 million, you gotta have a huge investment. Argentina recognized the only way you can get to that conventional level compared to Eagle Ford or Permian, need to encourage the investment. Current government is doing a great job maintaining that. Create jobs, stimulate the industry, stimulate the technology. Let me tell you, at the low prices they maintain for Chevron to continue to invest in Argentina in the same type of proportion as we are doing in the United States. That's my call.
Sarah?
Thanks very much. Sarah Ladislaw here at CSIS. I wanted to ask two quick questions of both of you. First, sort of pulling on what Amos started, which is a broader look at what's happening in the region. I think it's really interesting that this kind of situation that countries find themselves in today is largely a product of how they prepared for the down point in the oil market cycle, right? And so what we're finding for both companies and governments right now is that a period of low prices is a time to reset, right? It's a time to reset in terms of your governance strategy, and it's a time to reset in terms of your corporate strategy. the conventional wisdom right now is that we may be heading into a period of lower for longer, more volatile prices, but it's all predicated on, life not being what life traditionally has been, which is unforeseen circumstances and things we didn't plan on. What do you, as a company, Ali, and then you, representing the U.S. government almost, like when you're dealing with countries in the region, what are the things that you try to encourage or help them with in trying to prepare for whatever the future may or may not be in terms of their economic diversification or resetting their investment cycle, and where do you feel like you're getting the most traction, today in that? And then the second thing is something Robin asked at the front end, but I feel like we don't really discuss nearly as much, is, we certainly do have a lot of gas. Certainly a lot of gas in the United States, certainly a lot of gas resources, but an oversupplied situation currently. What do you see as the strategic role for gas going forward? It gets a lot of play in a climate context, but you don't always see necessarily how that feeds into industrial or government strategies. So just maybe in the regions you're dealing with, how do you see that role of a strategic role for gas, evolving in the conversations you're having? Thank you.
I think on the first question on how do we talk to governments, I think in the region specifically, we've talked a lot about the producer side and the effects on the producer side. There's a flip side, there's a consumer side here too. And we have in Central America and the Caribbean a dependency on Venezuela and on Petrocaribe. And I think that as you look today, you can't live in the past. So whether they prepared or not, I'm not going to fix that. So we have a set of circumstances. I think that when the oil price is where it is today, and I agree with you on a lower for longer, depending on the definition of lower, but this is the opportunity to diversify your energy mix itself and your suppliers. And I think we're seeing that in a sort of a mixed bag, but we have some countries in the region that have really done something about it. They bought back their debt. If you look at Jamaica and Dominican Republic, they are looking at diversifying. They're looking at some of their energy sources themselves being diversified. Countries that are on the producer side, whether it's Mexico, I think is a great example. They're sticking with the reforms. They're putting it in place. They know that you can't live on hope for $100 oil or $80 oil. They're figuring out how they're opening up. They're continuing with their bid rounds to attract investment into the deeper offshore now. And I think that they're doing all the right things as far as trying to maintain that. As we look both in Africa and Latin America, I think my main concern is stability and making sure that they actually have a plan and not, don't worry, oil prices will go up soon. And that was the plan about a year ago. So it was very difficult to convince people, it may not go back. They were choosing what to believe and who to hear from. So I think that's my primary concern, is looking at the stability picture for both the producers, but an opportunity on the consumer. The last thing on the producer, what we're seeing in some places is reducing the level of subsidies. And it's both the right time to do it because it's easier to do it when prices are low, so the effects are not as dramatic, but also it's more necessary. They're spending if you start looking at the percentage of budget spent on subsidies in some of these countries, it's enormous. The problem they have is, how do you come to a population and say, I'm going to increase your prices, but I'm not going to increase and not improve your services? So it's not an easy political issue, but we're starting to see it. And UAE has done some remarkable work on that. Jordan has done it. We're starting to see it in other places. But there has to be far more done in the area of subsidies. On gas, I think it's a missed part of the conversation, because it's not only that the United States is so robust on natural gas, and we talk about the exports picture now with cargoes, the first cargo going to Brazil and the second one going to Portugal. It's a bigger picture than that. I think that the technological innovation that Ali was talking about earlier is happening in that sector as well even now. So instead of looking at only the traditional way, but also looking at it from the perspective of, how do you get small-scale LNG to become economically viable, which could have a real impact in our own hemisphere. for the United States to be able to export smaller volumes into the Caribbean, Central America, and so on. The effect of the Panama Canal expansion opening soon and what that does to traffic and where it goes. So I think this is not only a great economic tool for the United States, I think it's good as you said before, on the climate side, a transition fuel, but it's also a geopolitical game changer for the United States. It's not a government, this is not something that was spurred by government, but surely has governmental impacts as we look around the world at the US becoming an equal exporter to Qatar, with Australia coming onto the market. It's a very, very different market at $4.50 spot price LNG landing places. This is a conversation unto its own, but I think even in this region, when you look at the interconnectivity that's happening, that could take an advantage of it. So connecting the grids in Central America, ultimately connecting to Mexico, connecting from Panama into Colombia, and since we're already interconnecting into Mexico ourselves from the United States, you suddenly create a very large market for gas and for power that goes from Canada all the way down to Colombia, covering all of Central America. These are, I think, really remarkable developments that can and will continue to happen, and we're going to see a very fast transformation in the region.
You know, our company goes places for long term. I mean, if you look at the two countries that we talk about, Venezuela and Nigeria, we've been in Nigeria for 50 years, Venezuela 75 years. And we got to deal with the different type of political structure and so forth. But for us to be having a sustainable business, it's very important understanding and knowing the direction each government is taking. You expect that it would be consistent. Actually, it's hugely inconsistent. And unfortunately, because they are heavily dependent on the oil revenue, each believe that their policy is better than the others. Therefore, we got to deal with the different sets of opinion. And it comes in, they look at it saying, we take Nigeria, for example. As Amos pointed out, PIB. I've been around PIB, which is a new bill government trying to pass for the last 8 years. This was and I mentioned that to President Buhari. I said it's a black cloud. There is nothing worse you can do about people not investing in Nigeria than to keep saying this is the bill will be passed, and it's been sitting for the last 8 years. But again, those are the policy that we try to work with the government, influence them. And our goal is trying to stimulate investment. And a lot of people believe that we want to be the only investors. Actually, I'm campaigning on behalf of government of Argentina to see more people, more company come to Vaca Muerta. Because why? We learn from each other. The reason we are successful in unconventional in the United States is because there were multiple operators and everybody learned from each other. And that's where the technology development comes from. Therefore, it's a task. When the system is changed, you got to be able to adjust it accordingly. And we're trying to really focus in on what is the best for them and what is the best for our shareholders. And sometimes it's very difficult. I mean, today we are under tremendous pressure in both areas, Nigeria and Angola. What's the level of investment? Considering the current climate. Fortunately or unfortunately, the market see it today. We got to see it in the long term. And convincing the market the decision we're making in the long term with what they are seeing today is a good one. Sometimes it's a very big task for us. On the gas side, I honestly believe the gas is going to work itself through the system. It's going to be a technology change. You know, right now we are talking about LNG plant that you will be able to put it on the barge. We are talking about offshore plant. Right now we're building LNG plant that costs $12 billion. Or you must have infrastructure of the United States that you'll be able to move it around quickly. But if you go south of our border, you look at the infrastructure of pipeline in Latin America is zero. The only piece of pipeline on the southern cone connected is Chevron initiated between Colombia and Venezuela, and it's working fine. There is no way you can push 1 MCF of gas from one place to another place in the entire continent, southern part. Therefore, I think the gas is going to play a significant role. It's going to work itself out through the pressure by industry, what you're going to do with these resources. We got a lot of gas discovered. And we're going to find the technology to be able to develop them and monetize them at cheaper price than in the past. One of the things that the low prices brought up changed our attitude a little bit. I remember about a year and a half ago, we were talking about break-even point for the company. Oh, $80, $70. Do you know what we've been working on to lower that? Trust me, one day we're going to talk about unconventional that you can develop it less than $40 a barrel. Because everybody driving that way. We are in the free market. That goes for gas. It's going to get there. You're going to see all this new technology coming in. We'll be able to move the gas around. And it's going to be a substitute for oil. I personally believe in that.
But you talk about the pipeline deficiency.
Right.
But part of the issue, the sentence before that is how cheap FSRUs are getting, or barges now, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's part of the problem of the pipelines.
Well, let me explain what an FS.
So a
explain what an
floating
FS
storage and regasification unit. So essentially, instead of building a $12 billion LNG terminal on shore, you can have a smaller terminal that's on a boat. Essentially, it's a boat. You take an old boat and you put a regasification facility on it. And those are proliferating because they used to cost $600–700 million, and that costs only $200 million. We've gotten to the point where countries get offers from energy companies or traders saying, don't worry about the cost at all. I'll pay for it. I'll give it to you for free. All you have to do is sign a contract to buy the gas. So with that becoming so much, so much cheaper, that's part of the problem of the pipeline story, because how do you build, the discussion in Central America on a pipeline has been to go from Mexico to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But the economics of that pipeline become complicated when you can have when the coastal countries can have LNG terminals and say, why am I going to pay the upstream guys, not upstream companies, but further upstream countries for the transit costs of the gas when I can have I can cut my own deal on LNG. And so we have to have a future of the LNG terminals, cheaper LNG terminals, with interconnectors so that their neighbors can benefit from it to make the economics of the LNG terminal better because it's higher volume, and spreading the risk base by having other countries being purchasers. But once you do that, I don't know that you need as much pipe.
Right. But the gas, we are looking for the gas development. I'm building on what Amos was saying. Not necessarily in the developed nation, but on developed nation actually can use gas much more effective. The way that you articulated in the point that you don't need to have a pipeline. For example, in the city of Benin, in Nigeria, a private sector has started converting cars to the natural gas. And there are 40,000 taxis has been converted to the natural gas. And just in Nigeria, the country that we are talking about, how much problem we have, they are going through that. Again, if you allow the free market to work, it's going to really substitute itself. One of the things that I still claiming in our country, we got to push much further for the gas. I mean, that is not just other alternative fuel, but gas. Look at the price of natural gas today. Look at how many gas wells are shut in. But technology breakthrough is going to be there. But I think we need all the elements. Eventually, you're going to have pipeline. You're going to have a small LNG. Right now, technology is there that you can have a LNG that can process 150 million cubic feet. You convert it. And it's not as big as probably this platform. Those are become the portable LNG that you can even house them in back of the service station. You go to Argentina, it's very difficult. You put petrol in your car. You got to look for it. All the cars are converted to natural gas. It's coming in. It's going to play a significant role. But right now, easiest, cheapest, fastest is oil. Everybody driving in that direction.
Thanks. Jennifer Cook with CSIS Africa program. And I wanted to ask about another African oil producer, Angola. In Nigeria, President Buhari, for all the security problems you mentioned, there have been important changes in the NPC, promises to break up the PIB. and not least of which is a strong signal on corruption and going after some of the big deals and some of the the kingpins in that. Also, Nigeria has a much broader economic base on which the government can expand its fiscal revenues versus Angola, where oil is still very much 30–40% of the economy. And I wonder if you're seeing any impact with Angola in terms of reform, in terms of thinking strategically on that, or just kind of a reshuffle of leadership in offices at the top. It strikes me that Nigeria at least has some accountability to the voter, Angola perhaps less so, and we're seeing a strong squeeze in public expenditures. So I'm just wondering what movement you see within Angola.
Go ahead. I'm going to build up on what you said.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Appreciate that. I think, as we mentioned before, I mean, you talk about the producers in Africa, Nigeria and Angola, the anchors of production in Africa. Well, the news today, Gabon rejoining OPEC. I think you're right. I think that Angola hasn't woken up yet to translate the financial crisis that they are facing with the kind of governmental change to look at both the issues of corruption, transparency, effectiveness, efficiency of the sector, but also understanding that the current status quo may be something that they have to deal with for a very long time. And the ability to attract investment, as they did with Chevron and others, is not the same anymore. So they are the prime example of suffering from that double whammy that I mentioned before, of not only are they getting less revenue, but they're getting less investment as well. And I think that's going to get worse as we go, because the less investment they have today, the impacts of that will be in the years to come, as there's some declines and other things that happen. I don't see that they have taken the kind of steps that they need to. I think they're very aware of the problem, clearly. We will continue to engage with Angola. We want to be supportive and helpful. Again, the stability there is extremely important to us, not only for Angola, but for the whole region. The underpinning of oil is important, and gas, for their success in the future. But it's not. They do have some other parts of their economy that they can lean on. But this is the time to wake up and see if we cannot survive for long without fundamental change in government and a diversification of the economy. It cannot be so. You can't build so much of it just on the energy sector. There's going to have to be a transfer of wealth from the energy sector to the creation of an investment climate that will allow investors to come in. I think we have plenty of examples now where countries that have taken the kind of steps that will not, put money to create jobs. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about change rules, change the regulatory environment, change the legal structures to provide the kind of comfort and overall investor climate that will attract investment across the board. And we can see the big difference in Argentina that Ali mentioned, and I'll be in Vaca Muerta in a couple of weeks, to the difference between a previous government and the current government. Look in Nigeria, and I can give you a dozen examples of what happens when you don't spend money for new investment, but rather create the kind of regulatory environment that will allow for investors to come in. I think they're going to have to do that, and the sooner that they get to that realization, the better.
We have time for one last question. I'm going to go more towards the back, I think. The lady in the back there with the light coat.
Thanks. I'm Paula. I'm a reporter for Climate Wire, and you've talked a lot about diversifying the economy of these countries and a little bit about gas and its role going forward. But I was wondering, what do you think of renewables, and could those potentially be a source of diversification?
Yeah. Well, clearly the conversation has been about oil and a little bit about gas. But what I started with was, I think the renewable story, it's about the definition of the word energy has changed. It used to be just oil, then oil and gas. And I think that the overall definition is changed dramatically to include all forms of renewable and efficiency standards. And If you look at what we're doing in Central America and the Caribbean and the real change there, and back also to combining that with Sarah's question from earlier, from a U.S. perspective, we've had the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States spend enormous amount of their personal time on the energy issue in this hemisphere. We had the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative that was all about how do we take a number of island states that have almost 12 months of sun. Many of them have wind resources. Some of them have geothermal resources that have never been tapped, and yet all they're using is expensive fuel oil imports. So it's both a security of supply and diversification, but it's also just makes, just common sense of using the resource you have. And when Ali talks a lot about, the country has a resource, the resource is there, I think we have to start talking in the same terms about renewable energy as we do about oil and gas, whether you have the resource. And Saudi Arabia has a lot of oil, but nobody talks about the fact that they have some of the best wind too. They just don't take advantage of it. So in our hemisphere, take Argentina for example, we're talking about the unconventional gas and tight oil. There's also tremendous opportunities in the renewable sector as well. If we look in Central America and what's happening in Costa Rica and in other countries of trying to look at how do we bring about renewable energy investment in order to diversify both economically but also the energy mix itself. So I think that where we're going, the reason, I said before, the reason the United States is a superpower in energy is not because of our increase in oil and gas. We are a superpower because we check all the boxes of the definition energy. And that's only going to grow. And when you have an example of, to me, one of the best examples in the world, a country like UAE, which relies on oil exports for most of its economy, and yet they're the ones that fought to host the International Renewable Energy Agency. They're the ones that created Masdar. They're the ones that removed the fossil subsidies, that put together now more investment into renewable energy for their own country. That's the example, that this doesn't need to be a story, renewable energy, of politics and of consuming countries. It can also be for producing countries. We are one of the only cities in the world that still talks about renewable energy as a political tool, of whether it's about climate or not. It's not. It's about business. And the reason we saw more investment in the United States in renewable energy in 2015 at low energy prices compared to 2014 and hit a record of $330 billion worldwide is not because of ideology. These investments are not ideological investments. That's a lot of money for ideology. This is about making money, and it makes sense. So renewable energy should have transitioned already to a discussion the same way we discuss other sectors from a financial perspective. It makes sense. It's cost effective, it creates jobs, and it supports diversification. So across the board, it's good. And if the same reasons why it supports the United States are the reasons why we should be supportive of it in other countries as they diversify the mix. But we can't be extremists in either direction. We can't say renewables is these crazy climate people. It's a business issue. But on the same front, we have to recognize that this is going to be a process into the next several decades where it's more of the above. Not all of the above, but it's several of the above. So you're going to have oil into the future, several decades. You're going to have natural gas growing into the future. Renewables are going to continue to grow from a relatively low base, so they have a lot of room to grow. Nuclear will grow in some places and decline in others based on politics. So we do have that mix that can all grow at the same time. We don't have to put all the eggs in one basket on one end of the spectrum or the other. But they're all going to grow, and I think it's incredibly important if you want to achieve real energy security and diversification. The measure is going to be how much renewables you have in that picture. Look at the Saudi Vision 2030 of the Deputy Crown Prince. Renewables is in there. The first tranche is 9.5 gigawatts. The question will be, are they actually going to do it or not? I think that will send yet another market signal.
I want to add what Amos said from the private sector point of view. His point is 100% on the spot about energy. Today, you can't talk about energy, just oil and gas. The energy mix is going to be there. And the reason we are going to be the superpower of energy, the United States of America, is because technology, innovation, and creativity and market are going to dictate that. We're going to shift from oil to gas. We're going to move from gas to renewable. We're going to go from renewable to something else. It's all going to be because of the free market. The market is going to demand it. and the market going to drive the technology. I remember, I give an example to many people about this. In 1980, when I was working for Chevron, we used to have a Cray computer. Some of you guys are young, don't even remember. Some of you remember. You had to have a room this big, cool it down. Amos is too young, even know what the Cray computer is, too young for that.
I'll
but
take that.
that computer cost $10 million, correct? Generate the same information, actually less than right now your iPhone does. In 25 years, 30 years, we got there. This is what we are talking about. Energy mix going to dictate that. We're going to have energy, alternative energy, that's going to substitute what you're seeing as a solar and wind and all that generation down the road. And again, the power is going to come from this side. I always said that our nation is powerful in energy is because of creativity, innovation, and technology. If we put that one on top of the resource base, no matter where it's at, we get it out. Look at, we are drilling in 10,000 feet of water. Everywhere there is a deep water operation, all the technology generated from right here. And that's what we got to drive it. And I think as an energy equation, we're going to continue to do that. It's not a political issue. It's not what is better than the other one. Sometimes as a private sector, they're trying to pull us in. Are you going to do oil and gas? It's all market driven. If the market dictates, we're all going to produce gas. If market dictates, we're going to move to oil. But I think there will be room for every part of this equation. We are not completely going to get rid of oil. We are not going to completely get rid of gas. We are not going to all have a windmill in our house to get the electricity out of the. We are not going to do that. It's going to be a mix of it, and it's going to be market driven. If any of these countries convert to renewable, even makes sense, we got to make sure economically makes sense to do that. It doesn't make sense for a nation go invest money, and I've seen that, to create a huge solar panel farm just for sake of having a renewal. That's economically is really hampered the country's situation. They got to build on the economy of the country. But again, my message is, when we talk about energy, we are in the same as what Amos pointed out. Total equation.
Our time is up. I want to thank you all, but I particularly want to thank the panelists, and if you join me in giving a round of applause. You didn't answer lots of questions.
Yes, I did. I answered everything.
Amos, thank you, bud. Good to see you.
It's good to see you.
Amos.